If you're at all familiar with exercise physiology, when I say the words VO2 max, your mind likely goes to things like running a marathon as fast as you can or getting world record performances. While these things are certainly true and VO2 max definitely influences your athletic performance in these Olympic-like events, VO2 max will also influence your ability to perform tasks of daily living. This is especially true for individuals as we age, when activities of daily living become more like athletic events. So VO2 max is a measure of how much oxygen your body can consume every minute. And the reason that's important is because we primarily use that oxygen to recycle ATP. Your body needs ATP, or this energy source, to perform work. Here I've illustrated ATP as a battery. Your body uses this molecule ATP to power everything, just like a battery. And it has three phosphate groups on it. And these phosphate groups provide energy. As your body or your muscles, for example, performs a muscle contraction, it's going to rip off one of those phosphate groups, and now you're left with only a degraded ATP, which is actually an ADP and an inorganic phosphate. So it's a partial ATP. Now, your body needs that ATP to continue performing exercises. If you don't have the ATP around, you can't do the exercise. Now, it might surprise you to know that our bodies don't store a lot of ATP. In fact, we store very little, only enough to get you by for a few seconds. So we're highly dependent on how well we can recycle ATP. And that happens with our bioenergetic processes or metabolism. And we have three major ways to do it, with aerobic metabolisms of fats and carbohydrates being the preferred mechanism for most of the time. But we can also do it with phosphocreatine, or the ATP phosphocreatine system, and glycolysis. We can break these up into aerobic and anaerobic metabolic pathways. Your aerobic pathways, like the aerobic metabolism of fats and carbohydrates, recycle ATP while consuming oxygen in the process. They're not converting the oxygen into ATP, but they just have to consume oxygen in order to recycle the ATP. So that's called an aerobic process. While these other two, glycolysis and the phosphagen system with phosphocreatine, they're anaerobic. They don't require oxygen to recycle ATP. Now, the issue that happens with these anaerobic mechanisms is that, yes, you can recycle ATP with them, but they're limited in their capacity, especially the phosphagen system, the ATP phosphocreatine system, can only do you for a couple of 30 seconds or so. But additionally, these anaerobic pathways also produce a lot of pollution, so to speak, for the muscle as it's exercising. They produce metabolites like acid and phosphate that impair muscle contraction and make you fatigue. So by far, your aerobic processes are preferred. Yes, they cause a little bit of pollution, but not nearly as much pollution, muscle pollution, or fatigue as the anaerobic pathways. Now, in exercise physiology, we measure aerobic metabolism by measuring exhaled gases, inhaled and exhaled gases. So this aerobic pathway, aerobic metabolism, you take oxygen in and then exhale carbon dioxide, heat, and water are produced in this aerobic pathway. So we can measure how quickly, or get an estimate of how quickly you're recycling ATP by aerobic means by measuring how much oxygen your body is consuming. So in this scenario, we have a person exercising on a cycle ergometer. They're exhaling all of their air into this tube, which then flows into a machine under the computer here that measures how much oxygen's in there. We compare how much oxygen's in the room air to how much is in their exhaled gas, and we can say this person's consuming 3 liters of oxygen per minute, or however much oxygen per minute it is, and that gives us an estimate of how much ATP they're recycling aerobically. So where we get our ATP from strongly influences the sustainability of an exercise. Let's assume that we have two people exercising side by side. They're riding these cycloergometers and they're riding at, like, let's just say, I don't know, 15 miles per hour. Okay, so they're doing a good deal of work here. To cycle at 15 miles per hour, it's going to require that you consume a certain amount of ATP every minute. And if you don't have that amount of ATP around, you can't keep doing the exercise. So side by side, this endurance trained person and untrained person, both cycling at 15 miles per hour, are going to be consuming about the same amount of ATP every minute. Here I'm illustrating it as 4 arbitrary units per minute. Now, where they get the ATP from is going to differ. So, as I mentioned, our bodies prefer to get as much ATP as possible from aerobic metabolism because it's highly sustainable. We can do it for a very long time, and it doesn't cause as much muscle fatigue and disturb homeostasis nearly as much as our anaerobic mechanism. So if you look at this endurance trained person, as they start to exercise, it takes a while for the aerobic ATP resynthesis to get going. This here is illustrating how much of the ATP at any given amount of time is coming aerobically. So at the very start of the exercise down here, very little of it's coming aerobically, but eventually they get to a point where the aerobic systems are up and running and almost all of their ATP is coming aerobically. This line here, which is saying ATP resynthesized aerobically, is directly related to the VO2, how much oxygen they're consuming. So if they're only getting, at this point, they're only getting about 50% of their ATP aerobically, where's the rest coming from? They have to compensate with these faster anaerobic systems. And these anaerobic systems are going to cause muscle fatigue, either by polluting the muscle with metabolites or by just simply running out of phosphocreatine and other things. Now, so for this endurance trained person, they get to the point where they're getting most of their ATP aerobically, and so they probably can do this exercise for a long time. But the untrained person that's exercising, doing the same exercise right next to them, cycling, we'll say at that 15 miles per hour, they are getting a lot of their ATP aerobically by the end, but not all. So again, just right at the beginning, very little of the ATP is coming aerobically. But by the end, they're getting a good chunk of it aerobically, but not all of it. So where's the rest of it coming from? The anaerobic systems. And this orange part here is what we call the O2 deficit. Same over here. Now, the larger your oxygen deficit or O2 deficit, the more likely you are to fatigue, because that means you're more reliant on anaerobic mechanisms to get your ATP, and that's just not a sustainable thing to do. Now, this untrained person, they might be able to get the exercise, do this exercise for like 5 minutes or so. They might be able to compensate for their ATP, get their ATP anaerobically for a while, but eventually it's going to run out and they're going to have to stop the exercise. They'll either have to slow down and do a lighter exercise or just stop altogether. Meanwhile, this person who's getting most of their ATP aerobically, no big deal. They could probably keep doing this thing for an hour or two or more. So where your VO2 max lies determines how much of your ATP can be recycled aerobically. So how do we measure VO2 max? Generally, we do it in the lab. We'll have a person cycle on a fancy exercise bike or go on a treadmill, and we'll start them off at a low intensity of exercise and progressively increase. So here on this is a graph published by Harold Laughlin in 1999, illustrating oxygen uptake, or VO2. I'll write that in there, VO2 in liters per minute on one side, or VO2 in milliliters per kilogram of body mass per minute on the other. And then the x-axis is, here he labels it work. This is kind of a mislabel here. That should actually be power in watts. So in a graded exercise test, we start off having them do very light exercise, and we are measuring their exhaled gases again, seeing how much oxygen they're consuming by measuring it in their exhaled gas. So you start off at a low intensity exercise and they consume a little bit of oxygen. Then you make them work a little bit harder, pedal harder. And so they're pedaling more, they're doing more work, consuming more ATP. so the VO2 goes up. Now after a minute or so, we increase the power output again, make them work a little bit harder or run a little faster. And so because they're going faster, they're consuming more ATP, so the VO2 goes up again and they're able to get a lot of their ATP aerobically. We keep increasing the power output until we get to a point where further increases in power don't elicit the expected increase in VO2 max. Either it plateaus off or they just have to downright stop the exercise. So now look here, we're at, let's say this is 150 watts and this dot here is 225 watts. They're doing much more exercise at 225 watts. So they're consuming a lot more ATP, but the VO2 is roughly the same. That doesn't mean they're not consuming the ATP. They still are, but they're performing that exercise by recruiting more anaerobic ATP recycling than aerobic ATP recycling or resynthesis. So this point right here for that person is what we would call their VO2 max. Now, VO2 max is highly trainable. The more fit you are, the higher of a VO2 you can achieve and sustain. With regular sedentary college-age people hitting around 30 milliliters per kilogram per minute, and people who are moderately fit, college students, somewhere around 55, 60 mLs per kg per minute, and endurance athletes getting up 80, sometimes people say 90 milliliters per kilogram per minute. So if they're consuming, let's go with these elite athletes, if they're consuming 85 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram of body mass per minute, that means they can recycle a whole lot of ATP aerobically every minute. Whereas this person, sedentary person, can't do nearly as much ATP recycling aerobically, so their exercises are going to be less sustainable. So how does VO2 relate to performance? Now, in this graph by Mike Joyner in 1991, it shows a relationship between running speed and VO2. And there's a couple of things you can do to alter this relationship and shift the line up or down. But we'll just assume here this simple relationship. So we got running speed and VO2. Let's assume that you want to run at 20 kilometers per hour. That is going to require you sustaining a VO2 of approximately 65 milliliters per kilogram per minute. And if your VO2 max is 50, you're not going to be able to sustain that 20 kilometers per hour. You might be able to achieve that 20 kilometers per hour temporarily by supplementing your ATP resynthesis with anaerobic means, but you're certainly not going to be able to hold it for more than a minute or two. So your VO2 max is going to determine what kind of exercise or what power of exercise, intensity of exercise is sustainable for you. So that's why endurance athletes are interested in getting the highest VO2 max possible. What happens to VO2 max with age? Well, it tends to go down, even if you are physically active. So here are data coming from the ACSM's guidelines for testing and prescription, where they've accumulated data from VO2 max data from people of all different ages, thousands of people over several years, and grouped them into percentiles. So let's look at the black line here. This shows what tends to happen with VO2 max as you age for the average person. Black line is the average fitness level or the 50th percentile. So your average 25-year-old or so, 30-year-old is going to have a VO2 max somewhere around 44 milliliters per kilogram per minute. This is the average of guys and girls together. Now, as they age, if they maintain their same training status, their VO2 is just going to go down and down and down. That kind of stinks, right? But if you are super sedentary at 25, your VO2 max is already pretty low, right? Now, check this out. This 25-year-old, sedentary, low fitness, very sedentary, low fitness 25-year-old has the same VO2 max as your average 65-year-old, right? That's no good. Now, fortunately for us, we can train and exercise and keep our VO2 max as high as we possibly can. With age, it'll still keep going down. You're not going to see 75-year-olds winning the mile race in the Olympics. But our training can keep it elevated. So here's our very high fitness level people. These would be your friends that are out running marathons when they're 25, maybe competing in college athletics, endurance events. If they maintain that same training status their whole lives, their VO2 max is still going to go down. And a lot of times it's at a greater rate than a person who's sedentary because these endurance athletes have more to lose. But look at this difference. This super fit 75-year-old has a VO2 max of about 35 milliliters per kilogram per minute. That is well above the VO2 max of your lowest fit 25-year-olds. So this 75-year-old is going to be able to walk around, climb stairs, jog a lot faster than some of your very unfit 25-year-olds. So it's super important to maintain fitness. Now, a beautiful thing about exercise is that you can always exercise and start exercising. So let's say that you start off as a 45-year-old and you're on this line here going down. Then at 45, you have this midlife crisis and you're like, man, I really need to start exercising. You can exercise so that you go up to this line and you can get fitter, but now you're just going to be going down on this trajectory. But the benefit of that is, let's say when you're 45, let's just make this simple, you go straight up and you get get as fit as physically possible. Now you have a VO2 max of 50. That's going to have a huge impact on your life, as we'll see in a minute. But it can also go the other way. Say you start off as super fit college athlete, and then you hit like 45 and you have a bunch of kids and you have a really stressful job and you don't have enough time to exercise, or you just get really unlucky and get some really bad COVID and get super sick for a long time, your VO2 max is going to plummet and you can go down low. Okay. Hopefully you're able to change and at least get back up to here or here as you age to improve your fitness. So this puts the VO2 max in terms of numbers, but I want you to want to show you how this has an impact on your daily activities. So here I have the same data with the VO2 max percentiles across age, and I'm putting in front of it the approximate VO2s required to sustain different exercises. So if you want to run 10 miles per hour on flat ground or jog 6 miles per hour up a steep hill, like a 10% grade, you need a VO2 max above 50 milliliters per kilogram per minute. So for this, your average 25-year-old, that's not going to be sustainable. They can't do it. They might be able to hit that speed temporarily, but not for long. Now, if you look at your super fit people, that's going to be no problem when they're 25. They'll be able to run 10 miles per hour on flat ground when they're 25, 35 or so. But then once they hit about, let's say 45, now let's go all the way to 55, now the VO2 required to run 10 miles on flat ground or jog up a hill at 6 miles per hour, the VO2 required for that is above their VO2 max, meaning they might be able to do it for a couple of seconds, but they sure are not going to be able to sustain that, right? So who really cares if you can't run 10 miles per hour when you're 65 years old? Some people might, like your Olympians, but your average American doesn't really care. But let's look at other things. Let's say briskly climbing stairs. All right, let's say you have to go up several flights of stairs to get to your apartment every day. Now, that's going to require a VO2 somewhere around 32 milliliters per kilogram per minute. For your average adult, that's going to be under your VO2 max till you're about 45 or 50 years old, meaning that you can sustain it, you can do it. You might have to slow down a little bit as you age, but it's doable. But look at your super unfit 25-year-old. Briskly climbing the stairs is higher than their VO2 max. So they might be able to go up a flight of stairs, take a break, go up another flight of stairs, take a break, or they might have to just slow way down as they go up the stairs. But look at this once that average adult hits about 45, 50 years old, now their VO2 max is probably under what's required for briskly climbing stairs. And so that's going to be very unsustainable for them. And they're going to have to take breaks. And as they get older and older and their VO2 max goes lower and lower, it's going to be less and less feasible, and maybe they can't do it at all. Maybe they have to move from the 10th floor down to the first floor or get an elevator or something like that, right? So the more fit you are, the better. Now look at these people who have had a really high VO2 max and fitness level. They can keep climbing those stairs at a fast rate almost their whole lives. So they maintain independence and function and are able to do a lot of things on their own. Now, other things, carrying heavy objects comes in up here. You have walking on flat ground stays below the VO2 max for most people as they age. But the closer something is to your VO2 max, the more unsustainable it is. So for this 75-year-old, walking 3 miles per hour is probably going to be really hard, and they probably won't be able to do it more than 2 or 5 minutes at a time, right? Now, the terrible thing is to just sleep and stay alive, you have to have a VO2 max of about 3.5 milliliters per kilogram per minute. And if you don't have that, you die, right? So maintaining a high VO2 max by maintaining your fitness level and living a good, healthy life, not only does it look good for your athletic performance, but it's also going to make activities of daily living more sustainable. Because as you age, climbing up that flight of stairs to your apartment is going to go from being something easy to something more like an athletic event. I had an older guy tell me the other day that aging is the most challenging athletic event he's ever done. And he was a college football player, football coach, just all around athlete. Aging is an athletic event, and you want to be as fit as possible to maintain your independence and your ability as you age. So exercise, train, visit your doctor, just stay as fit as you possibly can. Now, here are some suggested readings and references that you might look through for more information on VO2 max and aging. One or two of them on here are from me, but several other are from fantastic researchers that have done a lot on VO2 max. So I encourage you guys to stay fit and stay functional.